I'm Beatrice. I'm an illustrator, and tonight we are joining here in the context of Unseen Guests, which is a project that's part of the public program for the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale this year, in which John Akomfrah is the commissioned artist. And so Unseen Guests is a commission of 8 different artists based between UK and Sub-Saharan Africa countries. And we are inviting these artists to be in dialogue with John's work and proposing investigations with Pan-African archives, both in the UK and across Sub-Saharan Africa, and looking for sort of events, anticolonial events, and testimonies of climate change, thinking about John's research and methodologies. And I don't want to take too much of the time. Are you going to introduce the title of the project in any way, or no? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So just to say that the title really comes from an interview that John gave when he was talking about film Purple, and he's referring to the Battersea Power Station as this unseen guest that plays a significant part in the local community that really is damaging people's well-being, and that he didn't realize the role that it was playing until very later on. And then we were also thinking about how he refers to the archive as sort of the official archive and the unofficial inventory, like what is there, but it's not necessarily being seen beyond what is not even there, which is obviously, there's a huge erasure there, and we can also talk about it, but was actually there, but maybe the person who's looking at it is not being able to see it. So out of all these conversations, we are building the prompts for tonight, and tonight is also marking the launch of a book that James wrote. It's available in the library now, but also you can get some sort of vouchers there to get a 20% discount, which is very generous. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand over to James. Yes, and thank you. And just feel free to get any drinks or any snacks anytime you want. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Beatrice. It's an absolute honour to launch this book and to discuss this incredible body of work in the Stuart Hall Library. Can't think of a better suited thing really to discuss this body of work. As Beatrice has said, tonight's panel is as much to discuss this theme of the unseen, of absence in John Akomfrah's work. Perhaps more so to do this than to talk about the book, really. But I'm going to lean on what I've written in order to do so and try to pull through the way that absence and the unseen is explored, navigated, engaged with, represented across John Akomfrah's work. So I've titled tentatively, I'm doing the academic bit here where I try and sort of structure something like a tiny lecture. I'll see if I can keep it a bit more informal. Locating absence, figurations and configurations of the invisible in John Akomfrah's practice, with an image there from my sculptural work at the graveside of Tarkovsky, which I think is a really explicit in many ways figuration of absence, and I suppose I'll arrive at that shortly. Yeah, that's the book. I haven't really thought of any way to introduce that other than that's the book. I mean, you know it's a book because you're here. It's outside there as well. That's an image of the book. And that's where most of tonight's discussion from me will be coming from. The book is really gravitating around these 2 themes, which I've argued are integral to John Akomfrah's practice, that of the archival and of montage I'm not saying anything revolutionary in that. It's something that's extremely pronounced from the offset, from Signs of Empire, as early as tape slide works of the early 1980s, up to the most recent work, Venice. This engagement with the archival, with the archive, with a conceptual, almost philosophical understanding of what entails the archival, and with montage as its kind of historical aesthetic technique, which exhibits itself throughout John's work in so many ways. I want to begin by trying to pull through this notion of absence through these specific concepts. And there are two statements which have been made by John Akomfrah, which I think really pronounce that sense of the unseen and of absence itself through both the archive and through the use of montage. So in the first place, in this interview with Nina Power, he says that the archive does exist as a kind of official memory of place, a moment and so on, but the archive survives in a very complicated way the diasporic subjectivities. Someone made the point that diasporic lives are characterized by the absence of monuments that attest to your existence. He's referring there to Orlando Patterson's book, An Absence of Ruins. So in a way, the archival inventory is that one. So that notion of the archive as a kind of almost material monument in that sense. But it's contradictory because the archive is also the space of certain fabulations and fictions. So there needs to be, he says, a critical interrogation of the archive. And that notion of a critical interrogation and what that might entail, almost as a kind of methodology, is something that I was really trying to disentangle throughout the book. And this second statement on montage, which almost comes out in quite an informal way in this interview that he gives to Tape in 2020, when he argues that everyone who helped popularize the philosophy of montage was interested in one thing, deferred meaning. Somehow, he says, when things collide in this dialectical way, some sort of synthesis is engineered or brought about, and in that, a new form, a new meaning, or a new way emerges, which you can chase ad infinitum. So typically, enlightening in this almost flippant way, John Akomfrah manages to articulate something which I don't think tends to be, or hasn't tended to be historically at least, defined as a philosophy so much. But montage is almost a way of thinking, almost a kind of epistemology, we could say, throughout his work, a way of being able to ask certain questions. And it's a way of being able to ask certain questions that is especially well suited to engaging with the unseen, a way of being able to foreground something without making it explicit, but rather almost kind of demarcating it in a way that brings the spectator in. So in this sense, I've found the absence and the unseen tends to relate to the formal interrogation of the archive to challenge the absence of monuments, and as relating to deferred meaning, i.e. the meaning that isn't usually visible, something that we need to kind of arrive at, that's never already there in the image. Now, in early instances, I've argued in the book, this really relates to the notion of gesture. And I've kind of made these connections to more kind of early 20th century notions of gestures, going right back to theorists like Bertolt Brecht, but also more contemporary theorizations of gesture, and through the mid 20th century to several modernist filmmakers too. Gesture as it exists in Testament, 1980. I want to say 6. I don't know, I just tried to come to mind with a year without just having the songs in 86. So is testament through this absence of expressive emotion, this choice to perform in a certain kind of almost blank state, a kind of use of blank expressiveness that works as a kind of absent gesture here, I've argued. Now, Kavina Mercer's engagement with Testament is speaking quite directly to the use of absence He says that fitting for a survivor, the performance, is fitting for a survivor of post-colonial trauma who is both ghost and ghosted, agent and patient, whose subjectivity has been split between first and third person post-colonial trauma, who is both ghost and ghosted. And I've just repeated the quote somehow. He definitely didn't write that. Okay. So I said that there. And just repeated the quote. So yeah, anyway, you can see there how the absent, that notion of being missing, but also existing in spite of that. And that need to work with the image, work with the performance, work with what we're seeing in order to arrive at kind of understanding is how absence is working through gesture in the 1980s film. So it follows through into the start of the 90s too, with Black Audio Film Collective's Who Needs a Heart, where Michael X exists as a kind of structuring absence, argued. Who Needs a Heart, Akomfrah himself, instead shifted away from a political biography of Michael X, Michael the Freitas, who gets his name Michael X, obviously, following on from Black Power movements in the US, within the UK context, to a more archaeological project on gestures involving sex, crime, jazz, religion, rhetoric, uniform, romance, and race. So I wanted to show a very quick clip from Who Needs a Heart, just to give a sense of what's meant by gesture in this very kind of performative or non-performative sense, in a way that is demanding a spectator to engage in order to kind of arrive at a sense of meaning, this notion of deferred meaning that exists through gesture. Okay, so where in films like Who Needs a Heart, Seven Songs from Malcolm X, Testament, there's this use of a more kind of expressionistic relationship with performative gesture. We move in the 1990s as Black Audio Film Collective kind of ceases to function in that at least foregrounded collective sense, moving into this more kind of commercial vein with Smoking Dogs Films as quite a kind of pragmatic need to engage with the changing creative industries and the television film sector. The way that the unseen and the invisible, or absence itself, maybe becomes foregrounded is through the question of representation. Here, the way that I've tended to engage with this in the book is through engagement with contemporaneous theorists like Paul Gilroy, Stuart Hall, and Cornel West's notion of a new cultural politics of difference, which is, these writings that are happening in the late 80s, early 1990s, are being conveyed also arguably through Black Audio Film Collective's TV documentaries. We'll see a clip of The Last Angel of History, I think, shortly, hopefully, if we get on all right with the Wi-Fi. But another couple of examples here that I think speak to this would be a second Afrofuturist documentary, Goldie, When Saturn Returns, and also this more innovative engagement with notions of the Black popular in films such as Mariah Carey, The $1 Billion Babe, and Urban Soul, The Makings of Modern R&B, which you see an image of there. So in the TV work of the 1990s, I've said that there's a shift away from the avant-garde interrogation of post-imperial Britain towards the absent, neglected elements of Black Atlantic culture. Now, when we move into the kind of post-2000s era, where Akomfrah begins to work exclusively within gallery and museum spaces, we can see an entirely refreshed approach to notions of absence. And I think the first solo exhibition, Hauntologies, is really testament to this. So in Hauntologies, we have the free monitor screen installation Psyche, at the graveside of Tarkovsky, which I mentioned earlier, which is this very sculptural piece, almost kind of sculpture, sonic, photographic, mixed media installation. Peripeteia, which is, while single channel, as almost like an early incarnation of something that you see in this more contemporary practice. And The Call of Miss Redux, which is a return to an earlier film with some new material. Now, in this kind of post-millennial moment, I found Erica Balsam's work on exhibiting cinema in contemporary art spaces really productive as a way of engaging, because there's so much here about cinephilia, a certain kind of relationship with cinephilia in a way that seems to speak to the archive, and a way that seems to speak to these questions of the haunting and absence and the unseen. And in this sense, for me, it exemplifies contemporary museal cinephilia's ability to, what Balsam says, reflect on the historical institution of cinema, interrogate its present condition, and possibly open pathways into the future. And At the Graveside of Tarkovsky, in this sense, represents the limits of cinema. So trying to go beyond what we know and what we can see. So a very kind of material incarnation of the absent, rather than solely what we've tended to see on screens. John himself has spoken about Tarkovsky's mirror as representing the limit of cinema. I think trying to offer up this engagement with the kind of mammoth figure of Tarkovsky is an attempt to try to visualize that. Finally, I wanted to speak a little bit, I'll try and be really quick, about notions of site specificity, which is something that I've attempted to pull through in the book and something that I think I'd like to explore a lot further. And notions of relational aesthetics, which I think can be located in certain exhibitions of more recent cultural works. So I spoke here about the screening of Tropicos at the Tamar Valley Film Festival in Plymouth in 2014. Don't know if people are familiar with Tropicos, but it's a film about the, well, it's an attempt to almost kind of reenact some of the earliest colonial, it's so impossible to describe this without using this really horrible, like, what's the word, like euphemism, right? Forays, adventures, right? Just colonial misadventures into West Africa, which come from Southwest. So there's that relationship with the locality of that festival itself that makes that early screening of that film, it gives it this kind of site-specific context, which I think also speaks to later initial screenings such as Vertigo C, at the Venice Biennale, the relationship with the Arsenale itself, the place of Venice in Italian colonial and post-colonial, imperial and post-imperial history, of precarity at Prospect New Orleans, and what Akomfrah is trying to do with the figure of Charles Buddy Bolden, this pioneer of jazz music, screening the film in New Orleans, what that film's trying to tell us about that relationship with water and music and culture, all these things going on in that very specific space, that very specific place of New Orleans, which makes screening it thereafter something quite different to that initial one I'm calling a kind of site-specific event. And My Niece's African Soldier, even at the Imperial War Museum in London, which is another film I think within that very specific context, again, attains a kind of site specificity that can't really be replicated outside of that event either. Okay. Finally, kind of going full circle to what Beatrice said earlier about this notion of the unseen guest, relating to Purple, this mammoth 7-screen installation at the Curve Gallery at the Barbican, as an attempt to ecologically montage the unseen guests of climate change. I've described this turn in the gallery space as a spatial turn, and I think when we think about the kind of environmental context of these films and how that morphs into the gallery museum space, there's a whole other way of engaging with notions of the absent and the unseen there too. Okay, I've probably overrun a little bit. Apologies. Hopefully that sets us up for more discussion. I'm going to hand over now